So this next section is going to focus on contemporary archaeological efforts to contribute to debates surrounding migration. I will focus on the case of migration along the Mexican-American border, but of course, this is only one example of many current high-profile migration issues. As I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, I'm going to be discussing some troubling topics, so I want you to make sure that you take care of yourself during this lecture. As a heads up, I'm going to be discussing the grueling walk through the desert that many Latin American migrants take to get to the United States. I'm going to be discussing the economic precariousness of poor people in Latin America and the economic exploitation of undocumented laborers once they get to America. For migrants, the journey across the border is physically challenging and it's traumatizing. They're often exploited, and many people do die when trying to cross the desert. I'm going to discuss how the American government intentionally causes this harm to come to migrants. And I'm going to be discussing what happens to bodies that are found in the desert. I mentioned earlier what I won't be talking about in this presentation, but I do want to just go over the things that I am going to be talking about. Oh, and I'm also going to mention that I'm going to be talking about the racist attitudes that some people have towards migrants. I want to give you this information now because I think this can be difficult to process for any number of reasons. I want to make sure that you take the time getting through this lecture if that's something that affects you. It's important to discuss the things that go on in the world, but it's also important to recognize the difficulty of this material. So take care of yourself. So let's take a look at the picture in this slide. You're looking at discarded water bottles through the slats of a border fence between Mexico and America. There's three clear 2-liter water bottles. At the very bottom, there looks like there might be like a Gatorade bottle or some sort of electrolyte drink. And there's a black bottle at the top. These bottles are used by Mexican and other Latin American migrants crossing the US Mexico border illegally. And on the one hand, these bottles are pieces of garbage that have been discarded when they stop being useful to migrants. But I'm also going to show you that these bottles are archaeological artifacts. Before I get into that, I'm going to give you some background on the issue of migration across this border. Something important to recognize is that this problem isn't a problem created by the undocumented migrants themselves. And I'm intentionally using the term undocumented migrants. That's really important. Some people refer to them as illegal immigrants, and I think it's important to recognize that people are not illegal. They're just undocumented. The act of crossing the border without permission is illegal, but just because something is illegal doesn't mean it's inherently bad. So as I mentioned, this migration does not arise solely because migrants want to come to America and live the so-called American dream. As some in America might put it, they're steal American jobs. That's not the goal. There is demand for undocumented workers in the American economy. And this has to do with these entrenched labor patterns that go back over 100 years, where Mexican laborers would seasonally migrate from Mexico to America for work. And it was overwhelmingly a circular migration. People would go to America to make money that they couldn't make in Mexico, and they'd return home for the rest of the year. And I provided a few citations from the Mexican Migration Project, which is a really fascinating project that was put together by a sociologist and an anthropologist that looked at these patterns of migration across the border. And it's really interesting. So I'll provide some references for that as well if you're interested. By and large, migrants are taking the jobs that Americans generally will not do. A 2014 study looked at the jobs that undocumented workers take. Now, the data is from 2014. Remember that the labor market extends back decades. So, I mean, these are entrenched patterns and they might vary slightly, but they're largely entrenched. So migrants take jobs in agricultural industries, that's at 17%, in the hospitality industry at 9%, in construction, that's at 13%. Business services like landscaping, waste management, and aesthetic services are all at 22%. And these are all very labor intensive jobs with low pay, but often even at higher wages, Americans aren't taking them. And just a note, that's so 17%. It's not that 17% of agricultural workers are undocumented. It's that 17% of undocumented people are taking jobs in agriculture. So that's just to clarify. So in the 1960s, the US began to put limits on the number of seasonal workers that could come to America, but it didn't alter the supply of workers and it didn't change the demand in American businesses. So to this very day, the American economy still relies on these workers to do the work that citizens and legal migrants won't do. So these workers are paid less than minimum wage and they don't get the same workers' rights that citizens and documented migrants get. Uh, they may be made to work without breaks. They may be made to work in dangerous conditions. Uh, Here in Canada, you have the right to refuse unsafe work. They don't have that right. If they refuse unsafe work, someone else will take that position. So they work in these dangerous positions. And this is an issue also in Canada as well, the undocumented exploitation of undocumented workers. Um, so I'm focusing on America, but it is a Canadian issue as well. People continued to work seasonally in America even after regulations were put on it in the 1960s, and they would return home to Mexico because they could make more money in America than if they stayed in Mexico. Despite these new policies limiting the number of workers allowed, the numbers of seasonal migrants didn't change. Um, the demand was still there and the supply was still there. So, to address this in the 1960s through to the 1990s, a series of greater border enforcement laws were put in place. The laws sought to strengthen border security and prevent the flow of undocumented migrants. The Mexican Migration Project studied this long term, and what they found was that stronger border enforcement was actually counterintuitive if the goal was to keep undocumented people out of America. The cost of crossing the border was low back in the 60s and before. Um, and even up to the 90s, really, the cost was lower. But when crossing was easy and not risky, migrants would migrate from Mexico in that circular fashion that I mentioned, going to America to work and then going home to be with their family. So they weren't staying in America. As the costs of crossing the border climbed, as it became more difficult, as it became more expensive, as it became riskier, people started staying in America instead of going home. So, if the intent there is to reduce the amount of undocumented people living in America, it's actually not effective. And the thing is that politicians know this. It's not like they are unaware. Um, they knew this. Obama knew this before Trump. People told this to Trump, I'm sure, as well. But the thing about border enforcement is that it's politically popular. Um, so, for people who fear undocumented migration, building a border wall, which was Trump's big thing, I'm sure you know, building a wall was popular, even if it wasn't going to accomplish what it set out to accomplish. What I'm going to explore in the next couple of slides is the strategy of the US government called prevention through deterrence. It was a strategy implemented in 1994. It's the focus of the 2015 book by archaeologist Jason De Leon that I am going to focus on largely. We're going to look at his research in a little more detail, and I'm focusing on this as an example, archaeological example of public anthropology, but he actually uses a four-field approach to understand migration. It's a really interesting book. It was part of the Berkeley book series on public anthropology. It is quite upsetting because they do talk a lot about violence and death, but if this is a subject that interests you, then it's a book that I would recommend. It's in the bibliography at the end of this presentation. So, as I mentioned previously, prevention through deterrence is the name of the policy that was put in place in 1994 by US border security. At the time, border crossing was a lot easier. People would often cross in cities such as the city of Nogales, which is on the map. Here you can see it's an image of the western US and Mexico border. Nogales is near the middle. There's Nogales, Mexico, and Nogales, Arizona in the United States. So in the 1990s, it was much easier to cross the border in Nogales. And this is where the fieldwork of the archaeologist that I mentioned, Jason de Leon, was undertaken. So they could physically hop the small wall in Nogales and hope that the border guards wouldn't catch you. If there were multiple people jumping and only so many border guards, your odds were good of getting across. If they caught you, you'd be returned to Mexico and you could try again very shortly. Now, prevention through deterrence sought to change how people would cross the border. It became clear that adding more border guards was not an effective strategy to prevent migration. So instead, border security sought to make crossing the border so challenging and make the risk so high that people would not cross the border because it would be too risky. So you see in this map, I think I can do a pen here. You see in this map here, the twin cities of Nogales, Mexico, and Nogales, USA. In this urban area, a bigger, better fence was built. To the west, we see this bright orange desert here. This is the Sonoran Desert. I'm just going to circle it. In this desert, the fences are much easier to pass over, or there's no fences at all in some places. And I'll show you a picture in a moment, but they're much easier to get past than in the city. But passing or crossing the border in the desert means walking for days on dangerous terrain. There's very little shade, there's dangerous predators, and the heat in the desert can reach 48 degrees Celsius. That's just astronomically high. So migrants aren't well equipped to handle these extreme conditions. We talked earlier about how local knowledge was important in surviving extreme conditions. There are indigenous people in this region that live in the desert and know how to survive in it. But that's not the case for migrants who don't come from this region. Migrants also aren't well equipped to handle these extreme conditions. They can't afford shoes that will make it through the journey. There's only so much water you can carry on your person. And so the results are that prevention through deterrence has led to thousands of deaths in the desert. In Arizona alone, and Arizona is roughly the area that above the border that I've circled in the map, you can sort of see here the outline of the lower part of the state. So in that section of the border alone, between 2000 and 2014, the bodies of 2,721 border crossers were recovered. That's how many bodies were found, but the desert erases people. The weather conditions, the presence of animals mean that that number is likely just a small percentage of the actual number that people that died in that period in that section of the desert. We truly don't know. And it's because of this death toll that Jason de Leon calls prevention through deterrence a form of outsourcing border enforcement to the desert. So the desert deals with the migrants so that Border Patrol doesn't have to. If and when Border Patrol do eventually find and arrest border crossers, they often, save their life. They don't save their life because they put them in this dangerous position in the first place. But people are often close to death when they recover them. What's very important to recognize about this situation is that the United States government knew what it was doing when it enacted this policy of prevention through deterrence. It knew that there would be a great increase in migrant deaths. In 1994, when they implemented the policy, they acknowledged that it would lead to an increase in deaths. What they were wrong about was when they thought that prevention through deterrence would lead to a decrease in migration. That did not happen. In later years, they referred to the deaths in the desert as an unintended consequence of this policy. But it's not an unintended consequence because they wrote in 1994 that they knew what they were doing. So why are migrants putting themselves in this dangerous situation? These deaths wouldn't happen if people didn't try to cross the border, right? Well, it turns out that a lot of this migration is also a result of American policy. Not all of it, but that's a key factor, particularly in recent years. For instance, economic policies such as the North American Free Trade Agreement or NAFTA led to high rates of poverty in Mexico. It destabilized industries in Mexico. People lost their livelihoods and they needed money for their families in order to survive. So the US government enforced these conditions, these economic conditions, and aimed to kill people that try to escape the consequences by funneling them into the desert and outsourcing their border patrol to the desert. And then they intentionally obscure the actual impacts of their choices, the policy choices. America obscures the impacts of their policy choices. So we don't know how many people died this way, and the government does its best to portray the situation as an unfortunate consequence when it was intentional. And so, if you remember when we were talking again earlier in the semester about Paul Farmer, this is an example of structural violence. So, here's a picture of the Mexican American border as it runs through the Sonoran Desert. You can see there's bushes, but there's not real shade in the photo. There's no relief for people from the sun. You can also see how the border fence changes from a solid, large structure to like almost a garden fence that you could definitely hop over. There's nothing really there preventing people from crossing. And so these big fences, these border fences, are just designed to funnel people to more remote areas in the desert where they'll have a more difficult time crossing. They're not intended to keep anyone out. And so this next picture shows a group of people walking in the Sonoran Desert. Now you can tell these people aren't migrants. They've got quality equipment, they've got good shoes, they've got technical clothing. But I'm showing you this picture for a few reasons. I want to show you what a walk through the desert looks like. Um, People are on foot. They're carrying 2 water bottles, which is meant to last you several days in almost 50-degree heat. I mean, that's probably not going to last you that long. The terrain's also not flat. It's up and down, and you can see that large hill in the background. It's not an easy walk. And in order to avoid border patrol, migrants have to stick to the most difficult terrain possible. So they will walk on that hill that you can see in the distance as opposed to go around it because they want to avoid detection. And Border Patrol largely sticks to their all-terrain vehicles or to their trucks. So they're not going to climb a hill looking for people. But of course, walking on the most difficult terrain you can slows people down and lengthens their exposure to the elements. This is a good time to take a break if you need one. Just feel free to pause the video here and come back. If you don't need a break, that's fine as well. I'm just going to pause the video here for a second and then we'll keep on going. So, there's a lot that we don't know about the experiences of border crossers. It's a dangerous journey, even for those that survive it, and many survivors don't want to talk about it. Furthermore, undocumented migrants are generally not able to reveal their status in America without fear of deportation. And so, this is where archaeology comes in. You might think of archaeology as something that focuses on the past. Jason De Leon calls this an archaeology of the contemporary, using archaeology to investigate current events. Through archaeology, he says, we can question the distinctions between what we are told and what actually happened. So, in the previous picture, I showed you people in the desert carrying backpacks filled with a few possessions, maybe some food, with water bottles, wearing long sleeve clothing and hats to protect themselves. As people walk through the desert, they may leave behind things that they no longer need, whether that's because something's been consumed, because it's weighing them down. Their shoes may fall apart, so they may take them off. They may be startled by immigration or they may get robbed and they may lose something accidentally. Someone who dies in the desert may also have their belongings on them. And if migrants arrive at their final destination, they may shed their belongings so that they don't look like migrants. And that way they won't get stopped by Border Patrol when they finally make it to, Tucson or Phoenix or wherever they're going. So for De Leon, these discarded items tell a story of undocumented migration. And he pairs that with ethnographic accounts of migrants. And that so ethnographic accounts are information about the migrant experience that were obtained through interviews with deportees and with survivors. And De Leon is able to piece together the story of the migrant experience, and he looks at how these stories differ from the official accounts. So here's an example of the archaeology component of this study. In this photo that we see on the right-hand side, you can see a backpack. It's starting to deteriorate in the hot sun. Might not look like a backpack to you. In the bottom to the right, and I'm gonna pull out my pen again. In the bottom to the right, right here, uh, you can see a squished can that's probably carried some food for the trip. To the bottom left, this right here, you may not actually be able to tell what that is, but it's probably actually a homemade slipper or a shoe covering. So some people say that by wearing, a carpeted shoe cover like this one, that you're less likely to leave footprints in the desert. It's probably not true, but nonetheless, it's a technology made for migrants, and it's made by migrants based on these migrant myths that erupt about border crossing. It's a bit hard to distinguish what else is in this photo, just from looking at it. But if we were there, we could take a look at what's there and we could catalog it. And to De Leon, these are not just pieces of garbage, but these are artifacts, archaeological artifacts. So, what does a public archaeology of migration offer? One place where archaeology can make an intervention into public discourse is in how it counters the narrative that undocumented migrants are a force for destruction in America. That might have been something that you've heard before. The classic example is people saying, they're coming to steal our jobs, they're coming to hurt us. Um, I'm sure with the presidency of Donald Trump, so in the recent past, like you know what I'm talking about. This picture on the right is a screenshot from an article on homeschoolpatriot.com. And that's a monthly magazine for homeschooled teens, written by homeschooled teens. Um, it's got a more right wing or American Republican perspective. And I believe this article is from about 2004, so before Trump was elected, while Obama was president. Um, and it reads, illegal border traffic is hazardous to the environment. Note they use the word illegal. Um, Trash on public land in Arizona due to illegal border traffic. And the photo's from AZ Border Defenders, which is an organization, I believe, of volunteers that go out into the desert and look for migrants. And it's kind of heartbreaking, actually. Um, the caption reads, a couple of weeks ago, New Mexico officials warned that the president's move to set aside nearly 500,000 acres as a national monument would open up a crime corridor, making it easier for illegal immigrants to cross the border and for drug cartels to operate undetected. Designating the area a national monument won't protect it at all. It will just do the opposite. The National Parks, Forest Service, and Bureau of Land Management have known this for years, but evidently the Obama administration didn't get the memo. The article that I've provided the screenshot of, in the article, the author's trying to paint migrants as threats to the environment, and this threat is part of a larger narrative that tries to portray undocumented migrants as harmful to Americans and to the American way of life. There's this idea that migrants will harm citizens, that they'll take their jobs, destroy the natural space. They want to portray migrants as a destructive force that doesn't share American values. When we look through the lens of archaeology, we can see something different in this image. We can see containers of food, for instance. I've made this red circle here. We can see containers of food that people brought on the trip so that they can fuel their grueling journey. Walking in the desert is calorie intensive, and they need food to make sure they make it through. You can also see I circled some empty gallons of water in these yellow circles that I'm circling again now. To keep people hydrated on their journey, they bring those jugs of water. That's not trash. It is in one sense, but in another sense, those are tools that people use to survive. Of course, there's also a lot of clothes strewn all about and some backpacks. It looks like there's a backpack. There's a backpack. Lots of clothes and backpacks. And based on the work of De Leon, there is a couple possibilities of what this site could be. It's not just a garbage dump that people throw all their stuff because they've decided they don't care about the environment. Um, this could be one of the few shaded rest spots, one of the few places with water, albeit dirty water, um, that migrants encounter on their journey. Um, as a natural water source or as a resting point with shade, it becomes a resting spot for many groups. So people might be discarding these items to reduce the weight of their packs. Um, they may leave something behind that they don't need anymore that perhaps someone will need in the future. Um, so that could be one possibility. A second option is that this site's actually an endpoint for migrants. So, just outside of the cities like Tucson or Phoenix, the big cities in Arizona, migrants have to shed their backpacks. They have to shed their dirty clothes. They have to shed their water bottles. They have to get rid of anything that makes them look like a migrant who just emerged after several days in the desert. So, some people might use this image to try to provoke the fear of migrants and their destruction of American values. But what this image actually looks like, when you look at it from an archaeological perspective, is that these are the lengths that people will go to when they're trying to survive, when it's a choice of life and death. Of course, littering, if we want to call it littering, is not it's not a choice of am I going to litter or not. It's a choice of what do I need to do to survive in this moment. So, public archaeology can help us to tell a different story. This isn't just trash, this is a record of a group of people who are marginalized. We literally refer to them as undocumented. They're not able to be vocal about their experience without putting themselves at risk of deportation. But these are real people whose stories need to be documented because they're an essential part of what allows, in this case, America, but in the case of the Western world in general, to reproduce itself as wealthy and as prosperous. That doesn't exist without the people to do the labor. And that's not right either. The labor exploitation is not right, but this is a consequence of that type of economic system. So, what does a public archaeology of migration offer? In addition to countering the dominant perspectives on migration, public archaeology also does the work of holding the government to account for its role in the death of thousands of migrants in the Sonoran Desert. By pushing migration to the desert, the US government had intentionally made a choice to subject people to those harsh environments and condemn thousands of people to death. They knew in 1994 that there would be an increase in violence and death because of these policies. Even though in the present day they call these deaths unintended consequences, but it was an intended consequence. Furthermore, the bodies of those who die in the desert are never recovered because of what the natural environment does when someone dies. For those that survive and succeed, because not all survivors are successful at migrating, they must remain quiet about their experiences while migrating because they can easily be deported if they make themselves known. An archaeology of the contemporary, which recovers bodies and which recovers artifacts from the desert and connects those to the stories of survivors, is able to give a voice to migrants and to hold the governments to account for the trauma and violence that they enact. So the government outsourced its violence to the desert and intentionally obscured its relationship to this violence. But make no mistake, they are responsible. The American government is responsible for what happened to people in the desert. And public archaeology documents those stories that the governments tried to erase. On this slide, I've just provided a list of references to the few references that I made in the presentation in case there is something that you do want to read more about. So if that's of interest to you, great. If not, no worries.